All right, folks. Hello and welcome to a whole new Launcher Live. Launcher is, of course, the Washington Post's video game and esports vertical. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Mikhail Klementov. I'm an editor at Launcher. And with me today, John Elker. John, say hello.
How's it going, everyone? I'm also manning the behind-the-scenes stuff, so things might be a little janky at first, but we're gonna roll with it and see how it goes.
Janky is the byword today. It's the big word because we're talking about Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD, a game that was famously janky when it came out in the first place in 2011 for the Wii system, and is still pretty janky today, honestly. John, tell me a bit about your experience with the Zelda franchise. I guess I'll start off. I just played The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD. My review for Launcher is up on the website right now at launcher.gg. I I loved Skyward Sword when it first came out. In 2011, it was my entry point into the Zelda franchise. I had not played any of the games before, and I thought it was marvelous. I loved the little motion controls, even if they were finicky. I had a lot of fun, and I relished being a defender of Skyward Sword because I saw that a lot of people didn't like it, and for me as a first time Zelda player, I was like, this is neat. I'm enjoying this. I don't see a problem. Now, in retrospect, I realize that first of all, I didn't play very much of it. Having played, the HD remaster now, I realize looking back that I had only played maybe a third of the game when I was younger. At some point, I just put it down and stopped playing. So that was my Skyward Sword experience, and I just missed a lot of the stuff that would go on to frustrate me later. Uh, After that, my big other Zelda experience was Breath of the Wild. I'm sure that's true of 90% of people right now who consider themselves Zelda fans. Or for them, like, Breath of the Wild is the core gold standard Zelda game. But John, I'm curious about where you stand on Zelda.
Yeah, totally. So, first of all, I'm a huge Zelda fan. I'll cut to my camera really quick just to prove it. See if you can spot where amongst my desk there's not a lot of options. You can find the Zelda thing. But I've been playing ever since the SNES days. Basically played every single game in the franchise. I study it copiously. I've replayed it multiple times, and I've even played Skyward Sword a couple of times. Even though janky again is the word, right? It's an interesting game to talk about because Zelda's been going through iterations of remasters of their games for a while now, and it just so happened ever since Ocarina of Time that Skyward Sword is next, so I guess we got to do it. With that comes a whole slew of issues and things that I definitely want your opinion on, Mikhail. Mikhail is the one who graciously decided to take on the review, and if you want to read his review, by the way, it's down in the comments below. But yeah, so I've been a part of the Zelda experience for a very long time now, and as a result, I kind of look at it a little too closely, kind of have too harsh of opinions. But yeah, that's basically it, and I'm curious to hear what you think, Mikhail.
Before that, want to say hello to Dylan in the chat. We've got a Majora's Mask Pog going in the chat. Can we get some more Majora's Mask Pog going? My general feeling about Skyward Sword, and I think this will be very evident if you read the review, is there are bits and pieces that I really like about the game that I think are fascinating. I think the motion control is still fun, still probably the way to play the game. But a lot of those interesting details, the majestic details, the wonderful, the charming, the very rare stylish moments, they are all separated by miles and miles of padding. One of the kind of defining moments for me very early on in this game that I think set the tone, that made me very unhappy as I kind of kept going, I'll say it set the tone, was there's a point at which you get digging mitts pretty early on in the game, which let you dig in the ground at little spots that are designated in the dirt. You see this little like crack in the ground, you're like, okay, I can walk up to this, like spam A a bunch of times and I'll get stuff from the ground. And there are so many moments when you just walk up to one of these and you start digging, and the only thing that's coming out is green rupees. Just green rupee, green rupee, green rupee, green rupee. And that's the equivalent of like an in-game penny. And you get this miraculous kind of like interesting tool that is really useful only in one way that I can remember from my playthrough, which is occasionally you can dig up like special artifacts or this like gust of air that'll propel you up into the sky. Other than that, it is a complete time waster. It is just there are tons of these little specks all over the ground, and you walk up to them, and 90% of the time you're just getting garbage. You're getting nothing. And so you're just wandering around, wasting your time in hopes that like, oh, maybe like this next one's gonna be good. There's a lot of like, very early on, I felt like a gambler or someone who was like relapsing into a bad addiction. There's a moment where in the Elden region, you can basically play Minesweeper. There's a little kind of building off to the side, and there's this kind of like ugly gnome guy who's like, hey, play my game. It's basically Minesweeper. Like, you dig up rupees, and depending on the color of the rupee, you can determine how many bombs are nearby that'll end your like run of this one session. The problem there is that, as with those holes in the ground, like it's a complete it's just a huge toss-up. I wanted to not say crapshoot, but I just said it. Because in Minesweeper, there are specific rules. There are rules where you click on a tile and it says 1, which means, okay, there's like 1 bomb around. You click on a tile, it says 2, there are 2 bombs in the surrounding area. You have very clear rules and parameters. Here, there's chance introduced, where like a green rupee could be, oh, there's probably no bombs nearby. A blue rupee can be 1 or 2. And so you're really giving yourself up to chance. You are gambling, the rules aren't very strict, and for the most part, you are wasting your time. Like, to play this game is to enter into like, I think about Among Us a lot when I think about kind of wasting time productively, because in Among Us, the time wasters are used, and they're like inconvenient, and they're flawed, and they're annoying, but they're there to heighten the tension. You are being asked to waste your time because that ramps up the feeling of like, oh my god, while I'm wasting my time like connecting all these dots and going through a maze, like I could get killed right now. And that ramps up the tension. And here, you're on a mission to save the world, and you're constantly being funneled into these total wastes of time that contribute nothing to the game. And in some instances, in like the most odious instances of that, you actually lose when you do that. When you're playing bad Minesweeper, you lose most of the time. When you get there's like this reverse vacuum cleaner where you blow, you get to like blow dust away, dust and sand, and there are all of these piles, little piles all over the ground, and like half of those piles have enemies in them. They don't have anything useful in them, and the enemies aren't tough, but they're annoying because you have to do the extra swipe to kill them, otherwise they're just going to bother you. It is all time wait. It is all friction. It is all getting in the way of doing a playthrough in like a fun or interesting way when you're supposed to be saving the world. You're supposed to be on this grand quest. And I like riled myself up now talking about it.
To clarify, it sounds like you liked this game then, based off of
Oh
that.
yeah. He, the thing that I'm like genuinely curious about is whether I would like this game if I had more review time to play it. If I were playing Skyward Sword over the course of like a month, would I be as annoyed at the time wasters? And I still think I still think that I would be, to the extent that it would just make me stop playing the game at some point. Like I wouldn't be viscerally annoyed, but in the back of my head somewhere, I would notice like you're not having fun doing this. A lot of this is just like paint by numbers, and then in between that, you're just wasting your time again, not really doing anything. So I feel I've vented for a bit. John, I'm curious for your perspective on Skyward Sword.
No,
Take me into the John headspace.
no, honestly, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. The biggest issue that I think is a part of the Skyward Sword design is that there's just so much time filler, and a lot of it doesn't amount to anything. A major problem with the actual time wasters themselves is that they're trying to fill a story that is inherently not Link's. Without getting too into it and like too into spoilers, I basically just want to give the premise of the story of Skyward Sword, which is you're chasing after Zelda for maybe 80% of the game. And you're, through chasing her, seeing the actions that she's done to kind of correct the issues with the world. So it's really interesting because it makes Zelda, as a result, a really awesome character. It's like the first time that she, you know, isn't the damsel in distress. She actually like takes action and like does some really interesting things throughout the story. But Link is reactive to it. He's basically just seeing the aftermath of everything. So as a result, I feel like in order to pad out the rest of the game, because otherwise you would literally just have dungeon, 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 Zelda cutscene, dungeon, 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 that's it. They just fill out the game with wasteful crap, essentially. So I think that you totally hit the nail on the head. It's a frustrating experience because there is kernels of good in the game, and there's so many puzzles in the dungeons that I thought, wow, this is really cool. I want to kind of get your opinion on some of the dungeons because I actually do appreciate some of the designs of them. Like, how did you feel about the sand ghost ship dungeon? That one, like in my mind, like really sticks out as like a good one.
I on the whole, I'm trying to think like that one almost doesn't stand out to me because the more egregious stuff from some of the earlier dungeons does. I found that whole segment, especially in the lead up to the like ghost ship dungeon, really emblematic of the stuff I didn't like in Skyward Sword. There's a moment like the characterization, the design is really compelling. Where you have, oh, there's this like ghost ship out on the sea. It goes invisible. Like it's you're coming across like what you think are the like dead bodies belonging to the crewmates of this sort of like resurrected robot captain. There's a lot of interesting grist there. But then in the lead up, there's this like boat segment where you need to drive around through the like reconstructed ocean through time travel.
Mm-hmm.
And that section is like it's very dull to begin with. You're given the option to fight a lot of the creatures that are kind of spread out across the world, but you don't have to do that. And if you do, like, again, it is a total waste of time. Like, I don't think I ever fired the cannon on my ship until I got to the invisible ghost ship.
Yeah.
Or I guess sand ship is, yeah. Uh, and then the actual, what the design of that world itself was also weirdly off-putting to me. I didn't find anything interesting or compelling about the kind of ocean we were exploring, the world we were in. I was genuinely shocked because this is a line I think I cut from the review that I wrote, but Skyward Sword
Ooh, cut
feels
content.
like, yeah, you're getting a world premiere, a behind the scenes. Um, there, Skyward Sword feels like it has charm but no style. I think it is the way I would put it, where there are bits and pieces where I'm like, that's kind of cute, like that's kind of neat. But on the whole, like when I think about details from that game, some of the general designs of that game, I'm mostly unimpressed. There is the water dragon who you meet at about the midway point of the game, and I found her design really dull and uninspiring. There's something about the comparison between like Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild isn't entirely fair, but Skyward Sword feels like it has a kind of cohesive vision, and or sorry, Breath of the Wild feels like it has a cohesive vision, and Skyward Sword feels like a almost like a DreamWorks version of a Zelda world. Like not Pixar, but DreamWorks. Everything feels slightly B tier, slightly off in some way that really frustrated me. And that was especially, to loop it all the way back, that was especially apparent to me in the lead up to the ghost ship. And so, or sand ship, whatever. And I think I was nursing that wound going into that dungeon. And also tremendous displeasure with having to go back to like the first dungeon in the Faron Woods. That made it harder to honestly like see anything in a particularly positive light.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see. You've had some remove. You've had some time. What did you like about that dungeon?
So I mean, the overall mechanic of the dungeon is cool. I'm a big fan of Zelda dungeons that feel like there's a cohesive theme throughout it, and you kind of just have to you iterate off the theme. Like I think that Nintendo are the masters of this. You see it most prominently in Super Mario franchises, right? You'll go through a single classic level, and they take one concept and they iterate on that concept throughout the level until the final portion of the level, which is like a gauntlet of everything you've learned. And I think that Zelda dungeons are at its best when they basically take that design principle and apply it to their dungeons. And so I love the idea of the sand ghost ship, whatever we're calling it, because it takes that concept of just like, okay, so there's one version that's in this time period and there's another that's in this. And so they start with basic puzzles, and then it eventually evolves into the spoiler end that I won't get into.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so in that sense, I did like it. But to agree with you a little bit, I think that like kind of speaking to the time flare again, like the overall world itself of Skyward Sword is surprisingly small. And it forces you to backtrack all the time. Like I can't remember even how many times you go through that first dungeon in the forest. I feel like it's like maybe 3. Like it's ridiculous.
Yeah. I'm trying to think right now. There's the first go. You spend some time doing a trial there, which I guess you do in 3 places, but even still, there is, yeah, like the actual, you revisit the dungeon at a certain point. The other thing, one thing you just brought to mind right now is that in a lot of the worlds, there are scattered little hints at, oh, there's a game mechanic you will learn later in the game that'll let you make use of this thing that we're hinting at right now. So when you first go through, I believe the Linearu mines, there are all of these like markers hanging around that are for the like grappling hook. And the first time you go through, you have no use for that. What do I do with this? Can I shoot the like seed slingshot at it? That doesn't do anything. All right, I guess I'm just gonna move on and ignore this. But I did not, having gone through the game, I felt no compelling reason to go back and like try and use some of those things, try and discover little secrets and knickknacks hidden throughout that were kind of gated before by mechanics I didn't have, uh, because I didn't think I was going to get anything real out of it. The game very early on conditions you to, oh, a lot of the rewards here are fake or not really meaningful. You're not going to get much out of this. And then the idea of like, oh, go back and like try and use these new mechanics on these worlds. It doesn't feel enticing. It doesn't unlock a new way of understanding the space. It's just the same thing, but you can move kind of differently sometimes, or like unlock a couple rupees that you weren't able to before. Um, so I found that a bit frustrating to say the least.
Yeah, there's a lot of gameplay flaws with Skyward Sword, and in fact, this is something that I kind of want to pick your brain a little bit more about. But a lot of the design elements of Skyward Sword kind of feel like prototypes of what eventually appears in Breath of the Wild, which is the next game in the series. And so you've played both, and I'm curious because you played Breath of the Wild before Skyward Sword, right?
I played a bit of Skyward Sword when I was younger in like 2011. And then I sort of forgot about it for a long time. I was like, that was kind of fun, the bits I played. Because I realize now that I played enough of it where I never had to backtrack, basically. Which is maybe like the first third, first fourth of the game. And then there's a lot of going back again. And then couple years later, just about a half decade later, a bit over, I played Breath of the Wild when it came out, and that game rocks. That game is so good. It's the thing, one of the kind of dynamics that I get at in the review is that Breath of the Wild is extremely free and generous in terms of what you can do with movement, decision making, how you're going to address a certain challenge. There are all sorts of synergies between abilities. And Skyward Sword really locks you into particular avenues, particular ways of doing things. And one thing that I was kind of curious about as I was reviewing was, am I missing something really crucial? Is this like the Zelda experience and I just don't know it because I haven't played other games like this in the past? How much, I feel like I want to appeal to you as the expert here, how much of past Zelda games is like, we give you an ability, we show you a handful of ways to use it, and you walk around the space using that thing, and like, that is essentially it for now? How much does Skyward Sword mirror what came before?
I'm so glad you asked this question, because it definitely is. This game is a very interesting inflection point for the series, because the SNES and NES versions of Zelda were definitely a lot more open. They basically were the template of the Breath of the Wild. Basically, drop the player into the universe and kind of just let them explore and figure out stuff. Ever since like Ocarina of Time, though, the series got very templatized, and by that I mean basically like each game following it kind of like adhered to this one particular format, and the format is kind of the inklings of what you see here in this game in Skyward Sword. It's like, you'll go to a dungeon, you'll figure out that like you need some item, you'll get that item in the dungeon, you'll use it there, and maybe you'll use it one or twice outside of that dungeon, but that's basically it. And then you'll advance to the next dungeon and you'll get a new item, and it's rinse and repeat. And so that started in Ocarina of Time, and by the time that Skyward Sword rolled around, there had been, Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and Wind Waker that have all followed this format. And so at that point it started feeling a little stale. That's why I think that they attempted to make this game like a little more open, basically not really giving you like a direction and giving you the appearance of an open world. And while I think that like it definitely isn't as linear as the games that came before it, it definitely doesn't really succeed at like, what Breath of the Wild eventually achieved, which is like true open world where you can do whatever you want, like gameplay. And so this game is kind of like the beginning of that, but there's a secondary issue which you also speak to, which is there are very certain ways that you need to defeat enemies, right? Because it's like you got to swing this way, and then you got to swing up, and then you got to use your shield. And I think the main reason for that is because the design of the game was hamstrung by the Wii. Basically, like they wanted to make a game where it's just like the Wii stick is the sword, and they kind of just like got caught up in that idea. And so as a result, like the gameplay is, we keep using this word, but it's janky, and it's a little limiting into what you can actually do. That also kind of like rolls nicely into like my next question for you, because I'm sure a lot of our viewers are interested in this. How are the controls with this game? You played with button controls and not motion controls, right? Like, how did you feel about that transition in this game?
I played both ways, and I have to say I prefer the motion controls, because the key innovation of the HD remaster, I think, is that you have a free camera now. In the 2011 version of the game, there was a fixed camera. You couldn't move it around Link. You were just kind of stuck with the view that you had. You could change it by locking onto an enemy, but otherwise, like, because there is no other joystick on the Wii, you couldn't manipulate your view. And here, they finally added a way to kind of change the direction the camera is looking. But in the handheld version, the right joystick maps to both the swings of your sword and looking around or changing your view. So to look around, you have to hold down the left bumper, and you end up in all of these weird situations where you're trying to change your view, but then you have to switch away from that, and you have to swing your sword a bit. It's impossible to like sprint while changing your view, because the like configuration of fingers you need for that is not humanly possible. And so it's just kind of frustrating. It is glaringly different from the default that I think people are used to with games of this nature when you try to play in handheld mode. Instead, I found the motion controls really nice, actually, and one of the better parts of the game, because you end up in these situations where finally the guardrails are down and you are given, like, in contrast with the rest of the game, you have a lot of leeway all of a sudden. It goes from, you essentially have no agency whatsoever. You are following, you're in like an amusement park Hall of Presidents ride with puzzles. And then it switches to, oh, you're in combat? Like, the game tracks your motion. This is the most agency you could possibly have over how you play this game. And even the moments when it's a bit finicky and imprecise, like, there is something exciting about motion controls there. It feels kind of sweatier, more interesting than just kind of like button mashing. Mm-hmm. So I'm a fan of the motion controls. I wish there had been more somehow. Like, that was the part that really stood out to me. So altogether, I'm pro motion controls. I don't like the handheld configuration. I thought it was a real chore to use. It was not. It just, like, it bumped up against the Wii's design. When they tried to integrate the free camera with the motion controls, they just ran into problems. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I do. I am, I think, probably a rare fan of the motion controls in this case.
I was gonna say that's like a semi-hot take, but that being said, like, I totally understand and kind of agree with where you're coming from. It's like this game was clearly designed with motion controls, and like trying to map that onto buttons after the fact feels like, you know, trying to put something on a different design that it's not accustomed for. And so, yeah, I don't know, that camera thing in particular sounds like a nightmare with button controls.
And there are moments when I think the motion controls like work out really interestingly. There's one of the like rare majestic-ish moments is when you're playing the harp in the game. And with the motion controls, you hold A and you move the Joy-Con back and forth to the like rhythm of a circle that's expanding and contracting. And that feels very wholesome isn't the right word. It's almost meditative, honestly. That feels like the mechanic and the thing that is happening on screen are matched up. They are in sync. That feels right to me. I think it's those scenes are ruined a tiny bit just because in the background you always have your personal assistant Fee like with her mouth open and she's singing along and it looks really goofy. But those are moments where I was like, there is something, if you squint and you don't look at the like limitations of a 2011 game, there is something majestic and wonderful here. When you're flying toward the little island in the sky in the thunderclouds, where you commune with the goddess, like that looks really fantastic, partially because it is lo-fi. There are moments like that where you see the vision, you're like, wow, there's something really cool going on here. There is a boss fight, let's say midway through the game, where you fight this like 6-armed robot mech, essentially.
Yes. Coloctus, it's so good.
Yeah, and that fight is awesome. And just like thinking about this animated dark goo that has taken over the suit of armor, essentially, that's cool. I really liked the aesthetics of that fight, the vibe of that fight, the fact that it was imprecise and motion control-y. Like, that was one of those moments where the majesty of the game was in full swing for me. But then there are moments when the imprecision hurts and takes you out of the game. And that's moments like when you are dousing or in a menu or you need to look at the map, and as soon as you pull up the map, like your cursor's just veering off screen because you tilted the Joy-Con ever so slightly, and just like everything is completely out of alignment. And it is another one of those things in this game that is a minor nuisance that adds up, where there's a very easy fix to the controller issues, to like a desync, which is you just hit Y on the controller and it says, okay, this is the orientation. This is the way, this is the default for the controller now that you've hit Y. But having to do that, even for a millisecond, just like takes you out of the moment and says, oh, I'm playing a video game in front of a screen. The immersion is broken. You are taken out of the moment. And that is a bummer. I played the game for the most part on my couch in front of the TV, just sitting with the two Joy-Cons in hand. And every slight seating adjustment would send the gyroscope way out of alignment. And so I was constantly having to readjust, having to hit Y, and it made every moment slightly off. Like, it just constantly reminded me that I was using imperfect technology, which is a bummer when you are trying to play this, like, fun, whimsical fantasy game. So I'm pro motion controls. I was also always keenly aware of the fact that I was using motion controls. So mixed bag for me, but mostly leaning positive.
Yeah, I think that you kind of once again like described the experience pretty well. Like squinting, there are great things, but like overall, there's like too many design elements that are inherent to the fact that it is a Wii game that is too hard to overcome for this current system. I mean, I think that like it's interesting because the Zelda franchise has like obviously been creating HD remasters since the Ocarina of Time era, right? And I feel like with each remaster, it's diminishing returns, which like that sort of makes sense because like the closer that they get to like the current time, the less improvement you're gonna see. But it kind of just feels like with every game, there's just like something that's amiss with the overall remaster process. And in this, it definitely seems like the gyroscope and like the motion controls and kind of just like the identity crisis that this game has with its gameplay. But
Yeah. The interesting thing to me is that the HD remaster, like that element of the game was not ever super apparent to me. I guess you don't know that a game looks bad in the moment. So like when I was playing on the Wii, I was never like, this looks terrible. Um, and playing it now, I wasn't like, wow, this is dramatically improved. It looked fine. There were rare moments where I really thought like I could see the improvement, and that was mostly relating to NPCs' faces. Beetle in particular. When you go into Beetle's shop, there are moments when if you don't buy anything, he will drop you out of the shop through like a little trap door. And in that cutscene, he like looks back at you and you see his face, and it's so crisply rendered in a way that is like kind of unnervingly HD compared to like everyone else in the game. That was like the one time where I was like, oh wow, they changed the graphics. They like
Beetle's face is
upgraded
when you
this game.
noticed it.
Yeah, that is the only time when I was like, that is more high definition than I would have ever thought, than I intuited. That's really weird. So I don't know. I'm also not like a stickler for specs. So um I am not a person who notices frame rate stuff. I am completely unversed in that whole field. So maybe there's some glaring thing that I'm missing, but the HD, I don't even know if I should call it a remaster or what. Um it just didn't feel that profound to me, which is
Yeah.
fine, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe it's just an issue of bringing the Zelda franchise to the current console, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think that we kind of covered a lot of the gameplay and like the graphical elements and stuff, and I kind of wanted to, Mikhail, just really briefly get your thoughts about like the story. Of course, there are things we can't talk about because they're under
Yeah.
embargo, which is weird because it's like a 10-year-old game
Yeah.
in essence, but yeah, there are certain things we can't talk about. But just kind of overall, what did you think about this game? I mean, it's not a groundbreaking story, but like what did you think
Yeah.
overall?
I was honestly like, the story was the part that made me want to keep going, which I guess isn't like that weird, but there are fun characters in the mix. In as much as I don't really care for Link, Zelda, you start to realize as like more cutscenes play out, Zelda very clearly does care about Link. You get kind of a very vivid picture of Zelda in this game, I think. Um, Learning more about her, even through those snippets of cutscenes, the moments in which, uh, how to say this, where Link communes with this old woman in the woods, like learning more about the lore of the world. Groose in particular, Groose is a huge
Yeah,
standout for me.
Groose is
All of
loose.
those bits were really fantastic. I adored some of the characterization. So those are parts that I liked, and the story in general, I was pretty fond of. But the thing is, like, the main story, you get it in drops that are just kind of few and far between. Where in between what feels like the real story, you're getting a lot of like, this is a mine that runs on time crystals, and like these workers are like kind of annoying. Or like, here are the woods with the little kikwis, and like they're fine, whatever. Uh, oh, there's like an underwater cave, and everyone's kind of scared of you for a while, and then they're not. Like, all right. Uh, I was like pretty ambivalent about a lot of the stuff in the middle. Um,
Yeah.
but the pieces that spoke to the grander story, that gets at that feeling of majesty I was talking about, of like anytime the goddess was in the picture, I was like, all right, now I'm feeling it. Give me more of this. And a lot of the other stuff, I was like, a lot of the other stuff, honestly, like detracted from it. Where
Yeah.
like, oh, the goddess has like clearly bestowed me with power, but I constantly run into like gatekeeping characters who are like, I don't believe the goddess bestowed you with this power. Do this trial for me. Come on, this
Jeez.
sucks. So yeah, like grand story, capital R, real story, main story, I found fascinating. I was hooked. I was compelled. Uh, and then everything on the side that like happens to pad out the rest of the game and comes in the middle, like, whatever.
Yeah.
Not my cup of tea.
Yeah.
Where do you fall on all of that?
Yeah, I think that like one thing that I'm always curious because I'm like I'm too ingrained in the series, and like there's kind of just like no information that like gets past me because I'm just paying attention too much. But basically, one of the key factors of the story of this game is that this is the first Zelda game in the Zelda timeline, which, like, shock for anyone that doesn't know it, there's actually a Zelda timeline. In other words,
Yeah.
every game connects to the other games, which is crazy because, like, if you look at them, it doesn't seem like there's any connection at all. And but there's actually an official Zelda timeline, which I'll throw up on the screen in a little bit because it's fascinating. But yeah, so this is the first one that is meant to kick off the events as to why the other games occur. And in that sense, I think it does a decent job. It doesn't blow me away, but it's definitely a little more involved than some of the other stories in the Zelda franchise. And again, Zelda is, in my opinion, this is the best iteration of the Zelda character. I like that she has agency and isn't just like there for the ride along with Link, who does all the work. And also the main villain, Girahim, is fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
I have so much fun with that guy. I love like villains that are just having a great time being evil, and that dude loves being evil. So
yeah, Girahim is extremely cool. Also, like, fantastic music for Girahim.
Oh yeah.
I fall on there are definitely like games and media properties where I'm on the same wavelength as you. For Zelda, for me, having played Breath of the Wild, it was always like, you know what, I'm not gonna ask, and I like my interpretation is the right one. I don't care. And my read was always like, in Breath of the Wild, there were probably heroes like you before that everyone keeps referencing. Like, oh, there was like a Link in the past, and there is like you from 100 years prior or something like that, but there are also references to like more ancient heroes of the Link variety. And I was like, whatever, like, yeah, okay, there were other Links. Like, I'm not gonna dig into it. I'm just gonna take that as a fact. Like, don't care how this all lines up. Doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
But
and honestly, your opinion on it is like that's totally fine. I don't think you need to know the background stories at all for these games. It's fascinating information, and in case you're ever wondering why there are 3 different versions of Link in Smash Bros, that's why. Because they're literally different versions. But
yeah, that's kind of how I've interpreted it, which is like, yeah, they're like different guys, even though they have the same name and basically look the same. It like doesn't really matter. Yeah, so I almost wish that I don't know how you would do this in an open world game, but the stuff with Zelda being like an active player, constantly one step ahead, I found that structure really interesting, even though I can see how some people might view that as like artificial and frustrating, of like, oh, every time you like get to a place, Zelda is leaving and like you can never catch up to her. But I like that. I like that there are other people kind of alive in the world and you are a participant in their lives. To briefly touch on like Breath of the Wild 2, would be cool if there was something more like that. I think Gene recently wrote a story about Watch Dogs Legion, where he made essentially the case that like this game would have been really fun if there were a real single defining story here. And I do, in contrast to Breath of the Wild, kind of like that about Skyward Sword, where you're on a mission, everyone understands what it is. There's like a community of people where everyone kind of knows each other. Uh, that part I really enjoyed. So
Yeah, and it's interesting
that's where I come out.
yeah, and it's
Go ahead.
interesting that you actually brought up Breath of the Wild 2. This is one of the things that I kind of wanted to briefly touch upon. If anyone has seen the trailers, people have noted this on Twitter and social media, but basically, there are multiple shots that appear that basically look like they might be inspired by Skyward Sword elements of Breath of the Wild 2. I'm going to throw it up on screen really quickly, but just to summarize what it looks like, there are essentially Skyloft elements in the air now. So, like, you know, there are certain places that you're going to visit in the sky. There's actually, like, a Link sky drop that looks identical to the sky drops that he does in Skyward Sword. And so people have been speculating just based off of, like, what we've seen in the trailer, like, are things in this game going to show up in Breath of the Wild? What's that going to be like? And I don't know what your overall thoughts are about that. Personally, I'm, like, excited for the opportunity for that, because I kind of also desire what you want, which is, like, a little bit more of a story structure to, like, guide me forward. But what do you think overall about that?
The thing that that worries me a tiny bit, but I hope Nintendo figures out if they go this route at all, is in Skyward Sword, one of the things that I really liked early on and came to kind of be bored by was the flying. I would love if Breath of the Wild had even like limited bits of flight. You really went a long way with sailcloth or the glider in Breath of the Wild. Like that was useful and people found interesting ways of using that, and the game was designed around that in so many interesting ways. But like the loft wings are really like a fascinating companion character, a fun
Yeah.
mechanic at the core. The problem was that in Skyward Sword, there's not really a good use for them. They
Yeah.
are like glorified loading screens essentially. Because like thinking about how they probably got the game to work, you would fly in a certain direction, I'm assuming, and the game would register, okay, this person is going towards like the pumpkin lodge or whatever it's called. So we have to load in the pumpkin lodge right now. And then eventually you get there and you can land on it and just walk in. That also only works sometimes. There's some moments where like maybe you're moving too quickly or like you veer in a weird way and you'll drop and it'll give you a little cutscene. And sometimes you could just drop into a place outright. But it is essentially just a loading screen for a while. There's not very
Yeah.
much to do in the sky. There aren't that many ways to interact with that whole 3D space beyond just I'm going from point A to point B.
Yeah.
And if Breath of the Wild 2 really picks up and runs with anything like that from Skyward Sword, uh, I would love to see kind of more going on in that space. And I think the fact that Breath of the Wild, the first game, is so successful at just like everywhere you look, there's stuff to do. I
Yeah.
can't imagine that Nintendo will have that much trouble putting interesting things to do in the sky. I see the clips playing on stream right now and I'm like, God, that looks so cool. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. So altogether, I am very excited for Breath of the Wild 2. I'm not going to like go too intense with my expectations, but yeah, I definitely I noticed the thing that you called out earlier, which is that like there are moments that feel like previews for Breath of the Wild in Skyward Sword that are just done more interestingly. The design is better. The kind of mechanic itself is more fleshed out in ways that wouldn't have made sense in Skyward Sword in 2011. And I hope they keep pulling from that well, because the ideas in Skyward Sword are cool, even if I don't love the execution.
Yeah, you said it earlier, right? Like there are snippets of goodness in Skyward Sword, and it'd be good to pull from them. I love your
Mhm.
idea of just like, uh, what are those birds called again? The sky
The
lofts,
Loft Wings.
the loft
Loft
wings. Yeah,
Wings.
yeah. I would love to see them kind of just be like a glorified, like, horse in the sky, essentially getting you from place to place.
Mm,
Because you're kind of right, it is disappointing in how Skyward Sword, they're an isolated experience, right? Because like the
yeah.
sky is not where the dungeons or the action takes place. It's literally just the
Yeah.
location of one hub world, and that's it.
Hmm.
So it'd be cool to
That
see them take on a bigger significance in Breath of the Wild too.
that's honestly kind of the dream. I remember, this is taking us out of the world of Zelda. Um, I used to be a big Star Wars Battlefront head, and
Yeah.
the kind of long rumored Star Wars Battlefront 3 from like back in the 2000s that never came to be. It was being developed by Free Radical, which is coming back now. I think they remade Free Radical early this year to do um not Chrono Trigger, the Time Splitters, I think. But they were, the big pitch of Star Wars Battlefront 3 by Free Radical was, we will merge space and ground combat, where you can go, you're fighting on land, pew pew pew, I'm shooting the guys. And then you get into a spaceship and you go into the sky, and it's seamlessly, you are now in a space battle, and you can just go back and forth. Um, and if we can see a similar thing in Breath of the Wild, where there is stuff to engage with in the sky on the back of your loft wing, and also you could just kind of seamlessly drop back into the world, that would be fun. There's been no indication that that's going to be the case, that there's anything like that in the works. We do see a lot of the glider in the teasers that we've seen so far, but nothing
Hmm.
about Loftwings. But that would be fun. That would be cool. It would be the fulfillment of a very old dream. So that'd be neat.
Yeah, and
We have.
who's
Go
to
ahead.
say it won't happen? Yeah, I was gonna say,
Yeah.
who's to say it won't happen? I mean, the footage that we're looking at right now currently is
Hmm.
apparently some of the earlier footage that Nintendo has had, just like waiting in the bag for this. So who knows? Maybe there is some developments that are being taken from Skyward Sword, and there was a purpose to making it an HD remaster. But
Yeah.
it's a little speculative. But
Yeah. There's no like real information on this, but yeah, I am hopeful. That'd be fun.
yeah.
Dylan in the chat says Wind Waker kind of did something neat in that regard. Even though the ocean was vast, there were things to do like random ships or explorables. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah. I played a tiny bit of Wind Waker on, I think, the Wii U. And the ocean was more fun than like the sky is in Skyward Sword. There
Yeah.
are little islands throughout the sky in Skyward Sword, but those are activities in their own right. They have nothing to do with you flying around. Um, I'm interested. James Jackson in the chat said, I'm giving it another chance with the Switch release, but I'm keeping my expectations in check. And he wrote that after saying that he hated the controls and never got into the story. I don't think that enough has changed that'll make you reconsider that. But maybe if you're patient, that's the experiment. That's like, for me, the jury is still out on that, of whether players will like Skyward Sword if they are spending a lot of time with it. I think some of the like fun characterization around side characters can really come out if you are not in a rush. Like if you get the grappling hook and then don't proceed with the main story, there's just like so much random stuff that unlocks for you. You can go to like Beetle's place and get gratitude crystals from his like island in the middle of the night. There's just like random stuff you can do that unlocks that is not really available for reviewers because there are only so many hours in the day. I'm curious to see how players actually respond to the game over a longer time span, whether there are any reevaluations or anything like that at all.
Yeah, I'm curious as well, and I'll be giving it a play at some point in the coming days, and so we'll see. I was one of those people that kind of just like shrugged off the gameplay issues because I was invested and interested in the story. But now that I know what it is, I'm curious to see what my reaction to this game is going to be now. Particularly because it's got a lot of competition in the form of its own series with like Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild is just such a magnificent game in so many aspects, and so it's going to be interesting and hard to hold a candle to that game, especially when that game is also available on the same system. So we'll see.
That is, I think, as a concluding note, because we've covered a lot of ground so far. One of the things I wrote in the review is that, like, even though the comparison is not fair, Skyward Sword HD like necessarily lives in the shadow of Breath of the Wild. Breath
Yeah.
of the Wild is a huge game. It was super well received, like many people's game of the year, game of the decade for a lot of folks. And we're now waiting for its highly anticipated sequel. And in that gap between those two games, one super highly received, the other super highly anticipated, you drop in this game that, like, a decade ago it was not very well received. And it's just like, yeah, the comparison's not going to be fair, but like, it lives in a world where we have Breath of the Wild, and that
Yeah.
makes it kind of harder to reevaluate this game, even if they're super different, going for different things. Uh, it's just like it's tough to get out of Breath of the Wild's shadow, and it'll be, I guess, for forecasting like a decade into the future. I have no idea where the Legend of Zelda goes after the Breath of the Wild model. Um,
Yeah.
because I don't see, it's certainly possible. It would be weird if Zelda became like an Assassin's Creed style franchise where it's just we're doing open world from now on. Um I guess it's possible, but who knows? Uh, Not really sure how that looks.
Yeah, yeah. And I just want to give another shout out to the review article. If you're interested in getting a little more information in detail, definitely check out Mikhail's review. It's down in the description below.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And if you want to read anything else by the fine folks at Launcher, you can go to launcher.gg, or you can follow us on Twitter, or rather, and you can follow us on Twitter at LauncherWP. Uh, Thanks so much for hanging out. This was a super fun stream. Thank you to the viewers. Thank you, John, for chatting Skyward Sword and filling in my Legend of Zelda.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Well, as always, have a safe launch, launch crew.
See y'all.